Greetings, my dear viewers. It is I, Drahon, and welcome back to Pathfinder Hero Frame, where we take a look at the different ancestries within Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and see what heritages they have, what backgrounds might work for them, and what classes that a typical character of this race might pick. I am doing this series mostly for the newcomers who are just getting into the system, and to veterans who are tired of creating out of the box thinking and are just looking for something quick and easy to build. Nothing mechanical, just pure lore. And that's what we're here for, the lore of the elven race, and see what types of adventurers we can create by using that lore. And I'll be honest, I thought this was going to be a exhausting video, because in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition we have loads of different elves. But in Pathfinder, we only have the Ancient, Arctic, Cavern, Seer, Whisper, and Woodland elves for our heritages. That is 7 different heritages. Now, I'll go ahead and say that while the heritages are pretty nice, it is the ethnicities, or the subcategories of these heritages, because you could have a heritage that has 2 different ethnicities. For example, the Maléger, which have the Okoger, the Aléger, and the Caléger. 3 different ethnicities in that one different subgroup. Technically an ethnicity of itself, but you get my point. So let's go ahead and talk about these different ethnicities as well, because they are also somewhat important. You have the Eowyn elves, which are known as, I think they were called the Returners. These are the elves that sort of started it all. They came from their home world. I don't remember the exact name of it, but yes, the elves come from a different planet, and they came to the world of Pathfinders, what was it, Galarian, and settled here. And right before the Earthfall disaster, which we had talked about during the Azarketi video, most of the elves went back to their home world, but a few stayed. Some of them, which are the Cavern elves, went deep underground to try to escape the Earthfall disaster. Many years later, the Eowyn elves came back and tried to reclaim what was theirs, which had become a bit more difficult given that the other races were starting to make their mark as well. So anyway, we have the Eowyn and their subgroup, the Mordant Spire. They are a group of Eowyn elves who had taken up residency in, well, the Mordant Spire. And they are trying to reclaim the Aslanti culture. So they put on these special wooden masks and dive deep into the oceans to find the Aslanti ruins and try to get back some of the ancient artifacts from those ruins. They only like to speak an Aslanti. So having a Mordant Spire Eowyn elf would actually be pretty good for a sort of Aslanti adventure. Probably someone who is familiar with Azarketi. Then you have the Ayendela elves. Now let's see, which one was these again? Yes, the Ayendela were part of the Caverns, along with the Genenese. another subcategory of the Cavern Elves. Then we have the Desert Elves, who are Veyon. I am butchering these names today. Vir Inori. Butchered it. The Arctic Elves, which are the Elverani, or Grey Elves because of their greyish skin. Then you have your Woodland Elves, which are the Mahouge. Like I just said, they have their own subcategories, the Akouge, Alige, Kalige. And then you have a ancestry feat, which we want to go ahead and go over. That's why I brought up the ethnicities, because with the Shared Thoughts ancestry feat, you're required to have the Maluge, Ilvrani, or Verinui ancestry, which, as we just pointed out a second ago, goes for the Woodland Elves, the Arctic Elves, and the Desert Elves, respectively. So that is something to think about when creating your character. If you wanted this particular ancestry feat, you want to make sure you have one of these three heritages, if not also possibly having one of the other ancestries we did not talk about. The Ancient, the Seer, and the Whisper Elves, which can be roughly any ancestry. The Whisper Elves are definitely something we need to talk about because, wow, this is an interesting one. Your ears are finely tuned and are able to detect even the slightest of whispers. Let me take a mental note of that. This is going to be useful for a heritage I'm trying to create. Alright, so anyway, if you are coming from Dungeons & Dragons, I want to go ahead and go over those sub-races and see how we might be able to translate them into Pathfinder 2nd Edition. In Pathfinder 2nd Edition, it is actually stated in, well, technically 1st Edition, that Drow are a part of the Pathfinder lore. But Pathfinder 2nd Edition did change their names to the Cavern Elves. So if you wanted a Cavern, a Drow, you will want to go with the Cavern Elves. For your Wood Elves, obviously you'll want the Woodland heritage. For your High Elves, the Eowyn ethnicity will work just fine, but you also can go for the Desert Elves for your Sun Elf equivalent. If you like the Pallid Elf, I would also recommend using the Cavern Elves, since they have very similar features. If you're looking for Shadar Kai, however, this is not going to be the video for you. You'll have to stay tuned for the next video if you would like to play as a Shadar Kai, as the ancestry there is similar to the Shadar Kai. So, anyway, back on to our ancestry for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The backgrounds that are listed for the elves, at least as far as a recommendation goes, they recommend you take either the Emissary, the Hunter, the Noble, the Scholar, or the Scout. I have gone through all of the backgrounds and the different ethnicity groups to see what might work for a background. If you would like to pause the video, you can do so now, as I really don't want to go over each one of these backgrounds, but I have them listed here. And there are some very decent ones. For your classes, it is recommended that you take either the Alchemist, the Ranger, the Rogue, or the Wizard. Now, with that being said, let's go ahead and go through each one of these classes and see what types of subclasses might work for an elf. First, we're going to go with the first recommended class, the Alchemist. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't sure this one would work, but then I decided that the research fields of the chirurgeon and the toxicologist would fit well with an elf, especially if you're trying to get that drow feel from Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Definitely go with that toxicologist. But the chirurgeon is going to be your primary source, though I could see other elves taking on toxicologist as their alchemist research field. Next is the barbarian, probably the least likely class for you to take, but I did think that mentioning it would be a good idea, as one of its instincts, the animal instinct, did fit rather well with the elves. Though if you were to take the elemental wrath ancestry feat, the elemental instinct would also work decently. Next is the bard. I didn't really see too many options that would work for a elven bard, but I decided to go with the muses of the enigma and the polymath, since it seemed to fit with the lore presented to us, since a lot of the elven lore from Pathfinder 2nd edition had the elves lean into those artistic sort of themes. Next is the champion, another rare-ish sort of class. Not as rare as the barbarian, but a close second. I did see that the champion would still work for the elves, mostly the cause of the paladin. Again, if you wanted to go with more of that drow aesthetic, you could go with the tyrant elf, the tyrant cause, to get that drow theme. Next is the cleric, and we have a few deities to go over for your Doctrine of the Cloistered Scholar. The listed deities that we have for elven worship are Calistria, then you have Desna, Gozre, Nethys, Pharasma, and of course the Elven Pantheon, which has Elistra, Alceta, Cornuos, Findeladlara, Catephis, and Ulrol. I am butchering these names, really something awful. I do apologize. But those are the different deities that you might see on elf worship. Now, supposedly the elves actually will hop from deity to deity whenever they fancy, since they live for centuries. So, a few years they might see this deity as worthy of some sort of praise, but then they'll move on to someone else when they find the need to do so. Little weird, but that's just me. Moving on to the druid. This will probably be one of your more common classes for an elf to take. And for your druidic order, I would recommend the animal, leaf, untamed, or wave if you're going for more of that sea elf route, which oddly enough we do not have a heritage for sea elf, but if you were to go with the versatile heritage of the Undine, you could definitely have something rather close. Or maybe go for an Azar-Keti half-elf. Possible. Moving on to the Oracle. This one I found interesting almost as well as for a cleric, since some of the deities that can be found in the Oracle kind of overlap with the deities from the cleric. The mysteries of the ancestors, cosmos, life, lore, and time fit rather well with the lore that I was able to find. Moving on to the rogue. Of course we would pick the rogue here. The picture for the rogue is actually an elf ancestry. So, of course, you would try to figure out what roguish rackets might work for an elf. This one was a little bit difficult, I'll be perfectly honest. But I think that the Eldritch Trickster, Mastermind, and the Scoundrel are going to be your more common rackets. Eldritch Trickster probably above the Scoundrel, and the Mastermind would probably be tied with the Eldritch Trickster. Moving on to the Sorcerer, the bloodlines that I think would be the most common here, and probably the only ones that would be affiliated with the Elves, are going to be the bloodlines of the Fae, Imperial, and the Nymph, though more than likely it's going to be the Elf or the Imperial. Next is the Swashbuckler. The styles of the Battle Dancer, Gymnast, and Wit seem to fit quite well with how the Elves of Eowyn ancestry seem to handle themselves, since some of the Eowyn's did take up a more warlike sort of strategy to try to keep claim of their homeland from any invaders. Moving on to our final class, and it is the Wizard. Thanks to Pathfinder's 2nd Edition's player core updating the arcane schools, this one was just as tricky as the Rogue. Though I think the Ars Grammatica, the Civic Wizardry, and the Unified Magical Theory are going to be the more common arcane schools for an Elven Wizard. And that's all I have for you today. What did you think? If you're looking for some more lore on the elves, I will leave a link in the description for... I forgot the name of the channel, but they have a video going over everything about the lore of the elves, and I had to watch the video a couple of times just to make sure I was getting the connections to the elves and the classes close enough for the lore. But with that being said, that is all the time I have for you today, and I hope to see you next time when I am online.